Hi, I'm Eliav Bitan. I work for the National Wildlife Federation. We're doing a little bit of work with Climate Action Reserve, so maybe we can tie those things together. But I have two really nitty-gritty system thinking perspective. What would have happened to the manure and the compost had you not applied it? Number one. And number two, is there enough compost to go around? Because I certainly hope there is, but I'd like to hear what you think about it.
Yeah, you bet. Well, the manure we're using would have otherwise been spread on our local dairies. That's the common practice. Our dairies, for those of you who don't know, are basically grass-based dairies. We typically have more than enough pasture on our dairies to support their milk production. It's a pretty nice system. The compost would have undoubtedly gone onto the soil somewhere else. So the second question, though, there's about, I think it's about 10 million tons of uncomposted organic debris going into California landfills every year. So we see a huge opportunity there. And of course, that's the low-hanging fruit. 10 million tons is not enough to cover the state, but heck, it's there. It's pretty easy to get, and why not use it?
And that would also have been a source of emissions gone to a landfill. So composting that carbonaceous material captures that.
Exactly. And then, is there enough to go around? No, but one of the reasons I'm excited about this Creque carbon research project that we're moving into next is that I've worked with a number of ranchers, and I myself have found that many of our creek restoration efforts over the last 25 years or so in Marin County, they've been very successful at a certain level, and we've established willow over dozens of miles of creeks in Marin County, and that willow, typically a royal willow, it's a plant that moves. It grows, it falls over, it roots, it moves. And after about 5 years or 10 years, most of these guys are getting a little upset with their willows in their creeks because they've moved out into their riparian pastures, or they're blocking up their creeks, or they're falling over their driveways, or whatever it is. And at some point we realized this is an enormous source of renewable biomass for compost production, that we can harvest these willows on a sustainable basis out of our riparian areas, compost that material, and get it up onto our uplands. And so actually start, instead of having to import organic material or carbon from a landfill or another dairy or somewhere off-site, we can start to use our wetlands, our very, very productive wetland systems, as a source of surplus carbon for our uplands. And that's where I think when we start, like the carbon ranch model, I think that's something we need to think about is generating that surplus, which we can then use in targeted areas as needed.
Dave Jessup from Sylvandale Ranch in Colorado. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the experiments you're doing with high-impact grazing and that strange-looking fence you showed on the picture there, as a kind of a substitute for moving compost around, letting the cattle do what the compost does? Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I came away from this thinking that grazing is the superior solution. So how to get a mob of cattle moving through the landscape. I know Joe Morris is in the room, and he's very successful at doing that. The tumble wheel fence is a gadget, and in my system, I'm playing with things. I'm checking things out, and it met a need for me to be able to look at how to move them in a confined area, just playing around. The greater experiment for me would be to put 4 cows on, in our area it's 7 acres per cow stocking rate. So I would take 4 cows, 28 acres for 1 year, and then 1,460 cows on 28 acres for 1 day, and compare that. That would be an interesting event to keep track of. I don't have that many cows, so at some point I'd like to expand outward and have that conversation, maybe next to a feedlot or something like that. But that would be an expansion of that. Did that answer your question? Thank you.
I'd like to elaborate just a little on that, and that, again, going back to that graph with the arrows up and the soil carbon increasing, it's a theoretical framework for you to then hang onto your ranch and say, okay, I want to allocate more carbon to the soil system, I want to use cows to do it. So I've got a couple of options. I can trample that stuff in, or I can put it on as manure, let the cows put it on as manure. But I have to do that in a way that sustains or improves the above ground production, or I'm going to move the system in the wrong direction. So it's finding that sweet spot. And I missed Greg's talk yesterday, but I think my understanding is he did a pretty good job of talking about that. It's going to be different for every ranch, but you're going to want to figure out how to get as much of that carbon, that photosynthetic carbon, into the soil as you can.
So if I can expand further, the fence effect on a herd is interesting. When I have released that herd into a great area, they just run, and they cruise the whole area looking for their favorite foods, and then kind of revisit that over the next couple of days. If I put them into a small field where they can see the perimeter of it, they just start working and eating. And they eat it pretty uniformly across, and then we move. So their behavior is influenced by my management in terms of what I've described to them. And this herd, they're great animals, and they're really used to being moved every day. They come to the call of my voice now, and that I use that white poly tape, and sometimes with a charger, sometimes without. And we've gotten to this point now where I'm kind of suggesting where I'd like them to eat. And they'll generally stay in there. If there's a problem, I know they can just walk through that fence or hop over it or step over it. But by doing regular interaction with them, we'd move as a group. And they see me coming. I always explain to them what I'm doing. There are actually 5, I don't want to call them words, but if there's a problem with their water, there's definitely a trumpeting noise I hear, and I'll go right to it because I know they're having problems. If a cow got out and is in better grass, the herd makes a different call. It's kind of like, hey. And then, then if a calf and a cow are negotiating who's going to the other one, that's a different thing. I just leave that alone. But in terms of getting your animal impact, there are strategies. Working with them every day, though, is your best tool for that.
Hi, I'm Steve Rich. I'm with Western Counties Alliance and Range Magazine. You've got a lot of data that you haven't had a chance to analyze. I heard that. But do you have some observations you might like to share? There's some things that can be kind of obvious.
I'm not even sure where to begin on that one. It works. It's easy to do. It's fun to do. Cows are a natural fit. They're cooperative. We co-evolved with them for 60,000 years at least. They're just a natural tool for this. And the response in my system is fantastic. It's a great place to be now, and it was scary to me before.
I think the nugget for me was this understanding, this sort of epiphany that, we've all worked with soil carbon for a long time. I've been an organic farmer since 1979, and I've been focused on soil carbon throughout that time. But it was seen when we put that compost on and seeing the response of the grass growth and seeing that unexplained extra ton of soil carbon in the soil, when the light went on for me, and I realized that the reason, very probably the reason that grazing systems can work, when they do work, is because however those animals are being managed relative to the grass they're eating, the effect is resulting in an increase in soil carbon. And once you can do that, you start to bump the system up, and its entire behavior begins to change for the better. At the same time, as we've seen globally, most of our rangeland management has been in exactly the opposite direction. We've seen a decline in soil carbon, so we see that enormous amount of degradation globally that we're dealing with now. And so it's really just a matter of understanding what we're doing. And I think soil carbon is the metric that we really want to be focused on now. If we can look at that and keep our attention on that as we manage our systems, we're going to be moving in the right direction.
Judy Landris, Corpus Christi, Texas.
I don't see where you're at. Oh, thank you.
Did I hear you say that your compost is 100% organic dairy manure and corn silage? Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. I read somewhere that about 80% of the corn produced in this country now is genetically engineered corn. Do you use that, or do you care? Did you make any effort to use not genetically engineered corn in your compost?
We did. We actually tried to source non-genetically engineered corn, and we weren't able to source. It wasn't silage; it was stover, and stover being dry and really light and easy to transport from the valley, which is a long way away for us. Silage, we would have had to. We would have preferred to use silage, but it's much heavier material. We would have had to bring in a lot more of it because it's mostly water. We're not particularly worried about that genetically modified corn because we're not going to be feeding it to anybody, and we're not going to be propagating from it. So by the time it goes out onto our research plots, it's going to be stabilized compost, not corn.
Yeah, Bill Zadek, in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, and neighboring states, there's a general hatred among many landowners for willows and exotic riparian vegetation. I was intrigued by your notion of cutting willows and spreading it on the landscape for mulch. And could you say anything about your harvesting and transporting techniques?
You bet. It's interesting. We're having a little tug-of-war in the Marine Carbon Project right now because our principal investigator literally gasped when I suggested that we harvest some willow and make compost out of it. And I know, and I would say the same is true for our one of our UC Extension project partners. They're horrified at the idea that we might actually be able to harvest some carbon out of our creek systems. But I've been doing that for almost 30 years, very successfully. I've seen wonderful response in the willows. They love to be cut. They love to fall over. They love to break. That's what they do. And taking a little bit of that out of the system every year, if anything, encourages their growth. Basically, my basic strategy is to go in, typically, and I'll just harvest the biggest stems, pull them out of the creek. It's really nice if you've got a cable on a winch to do that. You can stay well away from the creek. There's virtually no impact to the soil. And then you just run that through a chipper and you can make compost out of it. And believe me, there's no negative impact there. You do it out of bird nesting season. You do it towards the end of the summer. The creeks are dry, and the creek stays basically young, vibrant, healthy, and very productive. Its carbon sequestration capacity, I think, is probably enhanced because you're getting the senescent trees out of there. Habitat's great. You're not getting these dead, decadent, unproductive sort of dead zones in these overgrown creek systems. If you want to maintain some of that for specific wildlife habitat, of course, you have that option. So I think it's just one of many strategies to look at.